Sharon Firebrace, and this is the Razor Sharp Review. I've got with me right now Dr. Ken Coghill from Monash University. Welcome on board, Dr. Coghill.
Oh, thanks very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here.
Yes, indeed. But it's a very difficult time in the economy, is it not? I mean, we've got a federal election that's looming, and at the same time, too, we haven't really got a solid budget. As a matter of fact, there's been some concern about the crisis of the management of the economy by the Turnbull government, if indeed the crisis that commenced really with Mr. Abbott. It seems to be that the policies are still under threat and under secrecy.
Well, I think there's a lot in that, and what we're seeing is that Mr. Turnbull is really only continuing the Abbott government policies and just putting a smile on it and hoping that we'll be seduced by the smile. But when you see what's coming out from some of the government supporters, you really have to be very alarmed. This talk of, for example, cutting out pensions and making people repay the pension out of their estate after their death. Well, that's just an appalling way of handling things, which is just totally out of kilter with what Australia has been used to, what Australians believe in.
Yes, well, let's backtrack a bit on that, because I mean, one of the big concerns about the Abbott-Turnbull government has been the fact that, with the Abbott government in 2014, too much involvement by the top end of town and big business has been the problem, because the 2014 budget was the National Commission of Audit, Tony Shepherd, and he was from the Business Council of Australia. But then now, the second rollout now under Turnbull, the Turnbull government, of course, has been the concern and the involvement of the ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Kate Carnell, as a CEO, addressing some of the very key issues, which is a direct strike at the heart of our democracy. With these change to pensions, as you're saying. So really, it sounds very much like a top-down, big business push, shove, trying to shove, democracy to the side, all of our services and programs, and dialogue and discussion and debate that we should have, and pink, green, white, yellow papers that we should be having, is all pushed aside as it seems that the corporations are in charge. And the second or third phase to that, I think, it has been, today, certainly with the Infrastructure Australia body that's been set up too, with some of their recommendations that they're going to start some changes of user pay, the user pay system to be instituted, particularly on roads, and to alleviate traffic jams. Now, obviously this is where, this is a mass problem. There's no discussion. It seems very much top down. It seems on all those three examples that the Turnbull government, who himself, Mr. Turnbull, is a BRW rich listed first Prime Minister of the nation, and Donald Trump, perhaps the first of America, a BRW rich listed multimillionaire, zillionaire. Can millionaires, zillionaires, billionaires do it better? And do they have a place in our democracy? Well, they haven't been democratically elected.
I think that's a fair point. And what we're seeing with Mr. Turnbull is that while he obviously has been very successful in private business, he's not showing that he can do the same thing in government. And what we're seeing is that, as I was saying before, he's really just parroting the Abbott policies and trying to put a pleasant smile on it and hope that the voters are going to be seduced by his pleasant smile. But the reality is that, for example, if you take that East-West link recommendation from the Infrastructure Australia, as the Premier of Victoria has pointed out, the business case has not been made out at any time for the East-West link. So how can the Infrastructure Australia possibly say that it's the third highest, or whatever the figure is, amongst the projects for Australia? On the other hand, we can take some comfort from the very high priority that they've given for the Melbourne rail tunnel, the new Melbourne rail tunnel from east to west. But you have to be worried that if they're prepared to give a high priority to the East-West link without having the facts on the table, what are they basing their support for the rail link on? Now, I think there's no doubt that the rail link is very well justified, but there seems to be a real contrast between the approach that Infrastructure Australia and the Turnbull government have given to the Melbourne rail link and the way in which they've handled the East-West road link. Seem to be completely different.
Yeah, so now on that point, I mean, we've got really Infrastructure Australia that's sitting on billions of dollars of taxpayer funds. Now, why is that not managed by our government? I mean, it should be in government coffers. I mean, the big concern and the mass interest.
I think it is important to just go back and understand how infrastructure was set up. I think by the Rudd government, and the idea was that it would give independent advice to government. So they would make technical assessments of what would be the social impact, what would be the economic impact, what would be the environmental impact and what have you of infrastructure projects. But it seems from this latest announcement, which has come out at a timing which is clearly political, that they really haven't been providing the independent advice that they were set up to provide. And the evidence for that is that they've come out with this very high level of support for the East-West link, even though there has not been a business case provided to justify that.
Yes, so I mean it's it's another rabbit pulled out of the hat, so to speak. In other words, so I mean it's on the hop decision making. The Rudd government was accused of on the hop decision making, but when you're in a state of crisis, you do things on the hop. But here, I mean, this is something that should be, perhaps reviewed, should be put back under government control. It is handling billions of dollars of taxpayer funds. Why should it be in private hands is a question. And then at the same time too, the policy making at this point in time, just prior to a federal election, the policy is, where has been the discussion, let alone where's the business case? So there's two major linkages missing, is there not? It's a top-down approach. It's it's almost dictatorial, which is top-down. This has been certainly frowned upon and condemned in the past by democratic nations. Is it not time to condemn this and to let's start to put things into proper democratic order?
I think the point you make about democracy is very, very important, because there's a lot of concern in a lot of Western nations now about the limitations to representative democracy. And the nations who are solving that problem are ones who have involved the community in the major decision making. And we've seen that in a sort of microcosm here in Melbourne with the People's Panel, which was used by the City of Melbourne to consult the people of Melbourne about the 5 to 10 year strategy for the City of Melbourne. And that seems to have been a very successful process. What they did there was that they invited anyone in the City of Melbourne to put themselves forward to be on a panel. And then from that panel, from that large number of people who volunteered, they selected a panel which was representative, demographically representative of the people of the City of Melbourne. And they spent several weeks going through what were the options for Melbourne in terms of things that could be built or things that could be changed, what were the options about things like tree planting, what were the options for levels of rates, all those sorts of really important things. And they came up with a set of recommendations which have been supported by the Melbourne City Council and, most importantly, supported by the Melbourne community. So I think that is an example of what governments need to do. That's a local government example. There have been some state government examples around Australia which have been very successful. For example, Eleanor McTiernan, who just announced her retirement from the federal parliament, was previously a member of the state government in Western Australia. And she used these participatory models to tackle some really tough issues in Western Australia, some areas where there was really strong conflict between groups in the community, and she used these techniques to bring people together, to get them participating and get them to help come up with a better recommendation and a better decision than had been proposed by the public service or business.
Yes, indeed. So, let's get back to the social democratic principle practice that's been around for intergenerationally, and particularly since 1901, which is when we federated. So, as a matter of fact, we're instructed by law to do that. As a matter of fact, we cannot step outside of this framework because otherwise we're stepping outside of legalities and that which was originally decided. So we need to have referendums to change the processes. But we've got government which is using plebiscites rather than referendums to endorse their work, and also to getting not just plebiscites and referendums, but also saying that I have a mandate. So if they've discussed an issue prior to an election, and if you vote that particular party in, they're saying, oh, we talked about it beforehand, you voted us in, now we can implement everything. So we've got a mandate. Would you think that these are fairly well abused? And they're outside the Constitution. How can they be legal? I mean, how can they actually do these practices?
Look, the whole concept of a mandate is very controversial, because when we go to vote, whether it was at the last election a couple of years ago or when we go to vote this year, we're not going to be voting on one single issue, and it may be that there's 10 different things that we take into account, each of us, when we vote, and we might be in favour of one thing that the government proposes and opposed to 9 of them, but if the government's re-elected, it doesn't mean that we've endorsed any one of the 10. So there is a real issue there about the nature of the mandate, and the answer to it is to actively involve the community in the decision making. So if you've got a proposal that you want to bring into law and implement, then the thing to do is to involve the community in consideration of that policy, firstly as to whether the community agrees with it, and then as to how it would be implemented if it ended up being implemented. And it's in that sort of way that we can end up with better government that has stronger support from the community and leads to better results.
Yes, indeed. So, as a matter of fact, they're mandated to consult the public, and if they follow those processes, then they do have a mandate. But or at the election level, anyway, when we elect in the electorate a representative. So, anyway, it's getting back to basics. So, we're finding that there's been stretching the margins, acting outside of law and outside of that which is democratic. So, we're seeing that that we've had a lot of business involvement. This seems to be like the trend at the moment, that business can do it better. We've had the 2014 budget, which was business-led. Now we're having the tax-led reform, which is business-led. And now we've got infrastructure development as being a business-led initiative. Now, I mean, we've raised some of the concerns about that this morning. I mean, obviously, are the public really going to accept this package by Mr Turnbull released today? Given the fact that he's broken the rule, not followed the appropriate processes, it's a top-down approach, and actually, as a matter of fact, the policies that are being presented are not in the interest of the public at large. As a matter of fact, it's appearing as if they're promoting, profit for the rich and profit for a profit economy. And not an economy which is a services and program economy, and an economy that's based in jobs and in a creation of wealth that we all share in.
Well, it really looks, from what's been published this week, that there are a lot of thought bubbles going on here. It's a whole lot of disparate ideas which really don't hang together very well, and which, even if the government did decide to go ahead with them, would be extremely difficult to implement. So, for example, this idea of converting pensions into loans that would be paid out of estate would be just a nightmare to try and implement something like that. A nightmare for the people involved, but also a nightmare administratively. And then if you look at some of the other ideas, like doing away with fuel excise taxes on petrol and motor registration fees, well, motor registration fees are a state matter. They're not something that's controlled by the federal government, and they've got no power that I can see which would allow them to take any sort of action on registration fees for cars owned by individuals. They might be able to do something for vehicles owned by corporations, but the vast majority of us are not corporations. We're real live natural people who live our daily lives with our families, and expect that the things like the state registration system is going to be dealt with by state governments rather than some almighty fight between the federal government and the state governments if the federal government tries to take it over.
Takeover is perhaps the operative word here, because it appears as if there's an attempt through this plan, this policy, that in a takeover of the states by the Commonwealth. That really would be seen to be a reverse of the 1901 federation.
It turns back a lot of things.
Turns back that clock.
And so far as we know, Mr Turnbull still wants to proceed with Mr Abbott's review of the Federation. And what he's proposing here is a massive change in the way the Federation operates, and yet he's trying to push it through with absolute minimum of consultation, absolute minimum of justification. It really is looking as if Mr Turnbull just doesn't know where he's going, doesn't know where he wants to lead the country, and is running the risk of just leading us into a dreadful mess economically and socially.
Yes, it's probably the same pathways of course, Mr Abbott, and that was that he destroyed himself and he became unpopular. His policies seem to be too extreme. Unworkable, extreme policies which are unworkable, which sits outside the framework of social democratic practice. So, obviously it appears that it almost split the party. Therefore, Mr Turnbull could be confronting the same future.
Well, he's certainly shaping up as someone who is no more competent as a Prime Minister than Tony Abbott, but on the other hand, nor is he as harsh and uncaring as Tony Abbott was.
Yes, indeed. So, we're seeing that there's been a change of, prime ministership from Mr Abbott, but now we've got Mr Turnbull, but the policies are the same.
The policies are the same, and it's very hard to think of an example where there is a significant difference.
Precisely. So in which case, what we've got is the business policies that are ruling. They are the power behind the government, it appears. This Liberal National Conservative government, the Turnbull government, and the Abbott government. That was the big concern. We saw that, the meddling by business as well. I think even in the Kevin Rudd time, when he was attempting to bring in taxes upon the mining world, the BHPs of this world, and of course to a pollution tax, and that we saw his demise. We saw his removal as the Prime Minister of this country. In other words, we've got to question who is the power of the nation, and big business has certainly got a big hand and a big foot in the management of our country in terms of the politics, and we're seeing now the economics as well. And so therefore this change and phase change that we're looking at here in terms of a spread of policies is of major concern. So they'd need to be condemned because they haven't gone through the appropriate processes that you've outlined that democratic countries do follow. We do have a constitution, they've bypassed those. They're sitting outside of the constitution, which means that they're illegal and unlawful. And therefore we need to really ensure that the government is acting lawfully. So the public at large obviously are being confronted with some policies which appear to be very extreme. They're extreme because they sit outside of the framework of social democratic practice. So extreme policies when you're talking about a pension and a family allowance as well. These are all listed actually in our Constitution, Section 5123A. And because they're scripted into the Constitution, we can only change them if we have a referendum. Now, and we've had not very many referendums actually in history have actually got up because the ideas being presented are so extreme and outside the Constitution they've been rejected by the public at large. So therefore, making pensions not a pension and one's a person and an individual working all their life, and the savings on all of that to therefore become eradicated, not invested by a government. The individual and individuals not to gain the benefit of that, to then to be put onto a risky loan. It's illegal. It's unlawful. It sits outside the Constitution, and it's ultra vires. It's not to be obeyed because it is unlawful. So, how far will the Turnbull government go in attempting to press their extreme policies on a population prior to an election, hoping that thinking that they might hope that the public's asleep?
Well, you would certainly hope that they're going to immediately and strongly reject the sorts of nonsense that's come from Kate Carnell on behalf of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So her organisation represents sort of the middle tier of business in Australia, if you like. So they're not the Business Council of Australia, they're not the big end of town, but they are the type of organisation and type of people who strongly support the Liberal Party, the sorts of people that you find as actual members of the Liberal Party, rank and file members of the Liberal Party, are the sort of people you would expect to find in the ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. But the sorts of things that Kate Carnell has been parroting, I'm sure she wouldn't have advocated when she was Chief Minister of the ACT, Liberal Chief Minister of the ACT, and I cannot imagine what's in her mind making these sorts of proposals as the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It just seems to me that what she's proposing is likely to create animosity towards the ACCI from people throughout Australia, because very, very few people in Australia would countenance the sort of extreme policies that she has mentioned in the last couple of days.
Yes, indeed. They are extreme. And they are extreme because it's for profit. It's an economy that's being converted into a profit economy.
And it's treating people as if they're all individuals without social connections with each other, whereas most Australians understand that we are members of communities, members of families, members of extended families, members of larger communities, and we understand that we depend on each other for our well-being. No man or woman is an island, as they say, but we all depend on the way in which others around us provide mutual support, social support, emotional support, financial support.
Yes, indeed.
And with that in mind, the pensions have always been an example of the social support in which we help each other through life, through pensions and other supports that we provide through government.
Yes, indeed.
And to think that that would be replaced by individual loans to individual people to be recovered from their individual estates at the end of life is something which is absolutely foreign, not just to Australians, but to every society I can think of. Even the Americans, individualistic as they are not so individualistic as to substitute personal loans for pensions. It's not the way in America, it's not the way in European countries, it's certainly not the way that we should do things in Australia.
Yes, and it certainly won't be. There's an election that's impending, and that's the federal election. It may very well be the very issue that will doom this government should they persist in this foolish direction, and a direction that is based on big business getting greater wealth, creating a greater divide between the rich and the poor in this nation. And it's certainly raised the hackles of common Australians as we've been out there on the streets also getting data and getting some feedback on these extreme policies. So therefore, the Business Council can't do it better. The National Commission of Audit can't and did not do it better.
Well, let's just have a look at some examples. And Clive Palmer came into Parliament big-noting himself as a successful businessman. And what do we now see? We see the probable collapse and closure of Queensland Nickel, which was what he proclaimed as his great business success story. And there are many, many other examples where, in fact, the business community has failed by its own measure when it's tried to do things, and it's almost impossible to find a businessman or businesswoman who has then been successful in politics. And even Mr. Turnbull is now proving to be far less successful in politics than he seemed at the time when he became the Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. So they are. Working in government is working actually in the public arena. So public law and public business is certainly two different spheres. So we're not there for in the public arena for profit to be gained and to be made. We're there really to provide services and programs and security and economic security, job security, employment security, sound educational opportunities for those within our families and our communities. Therefore, it's a social democratic principle that we're living according to. It's been intergenerational. So the public at large are implementing this across the board. And we're seeing that that's where the status quo sits. What's being proposed at the moment by the Turnbull government with big business is extreme policies. And these policies are certainly being rejected around really states and territories, as was privatisation, which is one of the key issues that actually ushered in a bigger control by corporations on a grip of the power of the nation and a grip of the wealth of the nation. Now, what's being proposed with Infrastructure Australia, which is the third major business body here, that's contributed to the direction of the Abbott government and Turnbull government, has been the selling off of state assets. Now, Victoria was the first state to sell off under Jeff Kennett, but we saw in 2014 and 2015 the pressure on the states to sell their assets. Now, in the what's presented today in Infrastructure Australia, they're recommending in the state of Queensland that Ms Palaszczuk, who's the Premier, actually sell electricity and all the grid and all the concerns, and sell that off so that the wealth that she makes out of that would therefore give her a position, or some dollars would be returned to her by the federal government to reinvest back into the state for infrastructure development. But I mean, this is obviously we've seen that privatisation doesn't work. We've seen that it is illegal and unlawful to sell the public assets to private interests. I mean, that's certainly in the Constitution as well, or the Road Book, or the Book of Rules, and that's in section 44.1, that those who we democratically elect are not to in any way entertain anyone on the outside who do not go through a committed oath to serve the public and to serve the policies of public policies. And obviously you cannot serve private interests, because then you bring in conflict of interest, pecuniary interest, and vested interest. Well, and we saw that with Mr Stewart, of course, at the top end of the week, and we saw that he had to be deposed of because he had vested interests of his own, whilst he was also Minister of Human Services. So that, I think, is a classical example, Ken, where you've got the mix of the two, and they just don't blend. You're either there to serve the public or to serve your own personal interests.
It's very clear at law, and what the law very clearly sets out is that if you're a Member of Parliament, your sole responsibility is to the public interest, to the common interest of the people, and you must put that ahead of any personal or other private interest, whether it's a corporation, a donor to the party, your brother, your sister, your wife, your child, your best friend. No one has interests which can come ahead of the public interest. So whether it's a minister or the lowliest backbencher in the Parliament, they must use the power and resources which they have to advance the public interest, and they must reject the temptation to put their private interests ahead of their public interest. And it's very clear from what Mr Stuart Robert did, and what caused him to lose his position as a minister, is that his actions conflicted with that very fundamental issue and very fundamental principle.
Yes, well, there's a lesson to be learned there, is there not? You cannot serve two masters. You love one and despise the other, and it is forbidden in the Constitution for a minister not to serve the public. So again, it's been a climate and a time, particularly during the Turnbull and Abbott government period, that we've seen a rise of corruption, of corrupt practices, and also to those that are ministers also, and those that are able to take advantage of some of the laws that exist, and for their own financial gain. In particular, the housing industry, the housing market, the negative gearing, That's been a big issue. That's caused a huge divide across the nation. That's an issue that's still rumbling. There's a lot of complaint about. There's a lot of people that are locked out of that. A lot of first home buyers. And yet we're seeing that the top end of town, the rich, those on $250,000 salaries, are able to take advantage of taxpayer funds so they can grow wealthier and richer, get more houses when others can't even get a house. They can't assure or guarantee that their family will be housed. It's a crisis, is it not?
Oh, look, it really is, and I think Bill Shorten has to be praised for the courage and leadership that he has shown in the last several days. Firstly, in the Parliament, where he was very strong in condemning Stuart Robert for what he was doing and for attacking the government over that issue. And I've no doubt that had Bill Shorten not been as strong as he was on that point, that the government would have tried to tough it out and allow Stuart Robert to remain as a minister. So Bill Shorten's argument, the way in which he pursued this issue in the Parliament last week was very strong, very persuasive. He was very animated. He presented the case very well and very strongly, and I've no doubt that he is largely responsible for the fact that the minister did have to leave office. But then at the state conference in New South Wales over the weekend, Bill again spoke there on the Saturday and made his announcements about negative gearing and about the capital gains tax, and again spoke very well. He spoke in a very animated way, clearly believed in what he was saying, and pushed the case very hard. And what we've seen, of course, since he made that speech, is that the coalition has been floundering all over the place as to whether or not they themselves are in favour of some reforms of the same type, or whether they're going to condemn him for having brought up the idea.
Yes, indeed. So, we do need an effective opposition. We need to be able to have every idea tested there on the floor of Parliament. And as you're saying, we're needing that strength to come through. And we need to test and pound it, really, out of those that are presenting the policies and presenting proposed legislation for the nation that's going to impact and affect us all. So here we're seeing also with the leader of the opposition, Bill Shorten, that he's taken the lead as well on the crackdown of major corporations. He said should the Labor Party win power, on the corporations that have been exploiting those the workers on cheap wages, if indeed the equivalent of sweatshop type wages that we've seen with illustrations with 7-Eleven, Spotlight, some of the exploitation of international students, etc. So therefore, we can't take it for granted anymore that Australia's going to be easy sailing. We've been in crisis government now, particularly from the time of the global financial crisis, but particularly under Mr Abbott and the National Commission of Audit's 2014 budget, which was so disastrous and perhaps the worst on historical record. So we're still dealing with that. We're still sitting with that budget, and perhaps they should have actually resigned because the government was actually insolvent at the time. And if you can't pay your debt off at the time, and if you've got insufficient funds to deal with your debt, well, then you are actually insolvent. This is a very interesting predicament that we find ourselves in, but therefore, fixing it and raising funds, is it, the opposition have been talking about some of their policies, cracking down on exploitation of wages, but, shaping the nation. Are they going to get rid of privatisation of public assets, tear up those contracts whereby corporations have been able to just greedily grasp most of the public's assets into their hands? Are they prepared, and have we come to that? The East-West link by the Andrews government, the contract on that was burnt. $17 billion the Andrews government actually saved the taxpayers of Victoria on the East-West link through cancelling that contract. They've certainly had other plans to develop other freeways and roads and alleviate congestions, etc., in the traffic. But, we're seeing that the crackdown's got to continue. The public out there are looking for leadership in government and are looking for leadership within the community. That is going to come from within the public sphere, not the business sphere, because the business do not have solution and neither should they. And they should not be sitting at our cabinet. They should not be sitting in our tax office, and we should not be having these quasi $57 million that's been spent by government to get outside public opinion, outside private opinion on issues which are relevant to the public. So, we are at a very difficult time. Does the opposition, does the ALP, do the crossbenchers, do the independents have solution here? We need a major shift in government, and we need a major restoration of government for the public here in Australia.
And one of the really serious problems that you highlight there is that with the cuts and cuts and cuts and cuts in the public service, it's no longer possible for the public service to generate the quality of advice and enforcement that they used to do. And a prize example is in fact the tax office, that it's now so reduced in its number of staff that it has great difficulty pursuing these cases, such as businesses who are disguising how much they actually earn and refusing to pay a fair rate of tax. In other words, a lawful rate of tax on the funds that they actually raise. And you've got these absurd, very artificial schemes where people sell Australian products and then pass them through some other market, such as Singapore, before they are delivered at the final end. And the Singapore company, which their Singapore arm, which has very low tax rates, collects the huge amounts of profit, which then are not subject to Australian taxation. So there are real problems for Australia, and indeed for many other developed countries, in the way in which Google and like companies quite deliberately bypassing their social obligation, ignoring the fact that they've got a social licence to operate, and treating Australia just as some sort of milking cow to squeeze money, to take money out of our pockets.
Yes, and like the collapsing banks think that the taxpayer is going to foot the bill. Well, I mean, obviously, as they saw, the taxpayer is not going to foot the bill. And as they saw too, particularly come election time, that the public will not vote, not only just for a GST, but certainly for a government that's not going to support the policies of the public, and where there's been some very strong debate and green, yellow, white document or paper and consultations take place. So it's more or less beware, is it not? To governments that act this particular way. So just as we conclude, we've had we've got the National Commission of Audit that was that scripted up that 2014 budget. We've had
in fact, the very name audit was a misnomer. It wasn't an audit in any normal meaning of the sense of audit. They didn't check through the validity of payments that have been made, for example, which is the sort of thing that audits do, and nor did they make any proper performance audit of the way in which government is operating in Australia. So it was a false name deliberately chosen by the Abbott government, chosen while they were in opposition, no doubt, and is an example of the sort of sleight of hand that's been used by firstly Mr Abbott and now by Mr Turnbull in continuing those policies to the disadvantage of the Australian community as a whole.
Yes, so we're seeing the gap widen, we're seeing, as you say, disadvantage occur. The gap is increasing between the rich and the poor. As a matter of fact, they've crashed jobs, and we saw a mass slump in jobs. It was close to 1 million unemployed before Christmas, November period 2015. But now we see that they've marginally brought in more jobs. They crashed the car industry we saw here in Victoria, which is historical, from the 1930s right through now to, that's 70, 80 odd years of sound employment that people had,
exactly.
And skills.
And we now can see that had the Australian car industry been supported when the Australian dollar was so high, it would again be viable now that the Australian dollar is back closer to its historical norm.
Yes, indeed. So therefore, we've seen key indicators ignored. by government. In other words, not sound management, not good management, not good governance of the nation. This is what the big concern is, and also people are looking for sound management, particularly of the economy. And I think that definitely the Liberal National Conservative government has lost that tag, lost that badge that they claim they have. Having the Business Council of Australia run the country is not the Liberal National Conservative Party through its being the elected representatives from the electorate running the nation. There seems to be a major mass deception here. There seems to be a shift of power and a change, and it's all illegitimate and illegal, and we would argue unlawful. So returning back will mean ending privatisation. Let's get back to really getting all the public assets back under the control, nationalising those back under the government, which is where we had it before. Mass profits would therefore be accumulated, including a bank, because we did see that the bank certainly does accumulate enormous wealth, and that's important for us too, for infrastructure development and also for housing and for loans as well. So we need to have that restored back into the economy, and certainly gas, electricity, water, telephone, bus, road, rail, tram needs to be returned back to the public, because it has not been, we've been cheated, because it's not been cheaper, it's not been better, and it has not created more jobs. As a matter of fact, all of those points have all been reversed. So therefore, it's change time by the sounds. But we're seeing that not just only the Infrastructure Australia proposal to boost and boom 93 major projects so that the banks can make greater profits, so that we, the public, are going to be submitted to a conscripted role of user pay to make greater profits for companies and corporations, because that wealth will not go back into the coffers of our banks and our treasury, because they're actually owned transurban, for example, with all the roads and the tolls and what's owned there, and the mass development will continue to be shoved their way. And we've seen there that there's been just millions of dollars really of Australian funds that have been really pushed aside in regard to that, and I'm just trying to find some of the greater detail on that. But the other major business icon or business iconic policy by the Business Council and business advisors driving for greater profit has been the Royal Commission into the union movement, and also to the attempt to set up the ABCC, and also with that to have the workers. I mean, we're talking about 10 million people and their wages being slaughtered, their wages being crushed. I mean, I agree with Bill Shorten that he wants a crackdown on the corporations that are exploiting the public. And, this, obviously with Dyson Hayden, the question that sits over him, his credibility, he came under scrutiny and didn't pass the scrutiny test. However, he still kept his position. That within itself has raised eyebrows. And of course, makes the Royal Commission to be a condemned Royal Commission of a waste of $80 million of taxpayer funds. But what of the bringing in of the ABCC? I mean, that's going to be a Stasi police type operation, a Star Chamber trial where you don't even get a trial if you're brought before the tribunal, etc.
What this case highlights is that Australia needs a national Corruption Control Commission, a bit like the New South Wales ICAC, but nationally. And that's what's really missing in Australia. And if there are some crooks in the building industry, then they need to be prosecuted, whether they be employers or employees. But the really crucial thing is that we simply don't have a proper way in Australia of monitoring and investigating allegations of corruption and prosecuting them where corruption occurs outside the very, very narrow areas which are presently covered by what's called ACLI. So one of the things we desperately need in Australia is a nationwide Corruption Control Commission which can investigate any aspect of federal government responsibility.
Yes, indeed. And that is hot news. That is the hot issue. These are the directions, and people don't want to be subjected to as like a Stasi-style police policing system that is a reckless concept. It's an extreme right concept. It has no place in a social democratic practice. And although we do want law-abiding unions, but that is, when we talk about unions too, we're talking about everyone. I mean, there's the National Commission of Audit or the Business Council of Australia is said to be a union. All of them should have been subjected to an inspection or Royal Commission investigation by the Abbott government, and it's gone on now to the Turnbull government. So it has been what they've termed a witch hunt. It has been an attempt to, at the right time, throw enough mud, and particularly a trial by media mud that's been thrown, and whereby people haven't had a chance to have their issues tested in courts. Neither have they been directed to court. They've been subjected to trial by media and declared guilty. I mean, what are we into? We're into Star Chamber trial. We're into dictatorship. We're into trial by big business. We're into, bullying people out of the way so that that they can get greater profit from the public at large. Surely this is reckless management.
Oh, it is, and one of the prize examples where there needs to be proper investigation by an anti-corruption body is donations to political parties. And that's been called for by many, many people now. Journalists are starting to call for it also. And we are way behind the standards which are set in places like Britain and Canada, and for that matter in the New South Wales state election system. All of those have much, much stronger restrictions over who can donate and the conditions under which they can donate than in Australia. So in Australia, what we need to do is to ban donations by corporations, ban donations by unions, and to severely limit the amount that can be donated by individuals, so that you don't get the likes of your Clive Palmer or Donald Trump being able to buy their way into political office.
Yes, and political power, and that's what it's about. I mean, if you control the flow of power, you get closest to the Prime Minister or the Premier or those in council, as we've seen, because local government too has fallen into the trap. And we've seen by property developers more secret meetings, secret council meetings are on the rise. But anyway, it's all to be stamped out. So as we're saying too, and if we're going to have a Royal Commission investigations, we need to subject the banks and the financial advisors to the very same process. We need to certainly, run everyone across the bed of nails. There should be no exception, and we shouldn't be just targeting one aspect of the economy. We've got to really, have a thorough advance of eradication of anything that is corrupt from our midst. So I want to. I think we've covered a lot here in this particular interview, Dr. Coghill. But I mean, obviously, as we look to the federal election that's due upon us, the public. I mean, we've seen a decline, something like 53 of the Liberal Party. The ALP are now up to 48. The margin between is shortening. What do you expect as we close on this particular point shortly?
Look, I think that the Turnbull government is rapidly losing its gloss and its attractiveness, and there is a real possibility that there will be a change of government to a Shorten-led Labor government at the end of the year. But a lot of things can happen between now and then, so it's really important to keep raising and debating the sorts of issues that you've raised with me today.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Thank you.
Standing strong.